For today, we are learning how to complete the square. We will need this skill in order to do completing the square, changing our conic formulas from general form to standard form. So, as you can see, there are 3 steps to the basic process, and we have our example over here on the right. Take a second, go through, write it down before we get started. All right, now we're going to go through. We'll start up our recording. All right, first thing we have to do is we have to take half of the b value of the equation. A is always with x squared, b is always with plain old x. And if you think half of 6 is 3. The second thing we have to do is to determine the square root of the first term. And if you think the square root of x squared is going to be just plain old x. Now the third thing we need to do is we're going to place the square root of the first term and the amount from step 1 in parentheses and square it. And as you can see, the square root goes in front, then behind it goes half of the b with the sign it had, and it gets squared. And then it says we need to add the amount from step 1 squared to the right-hand side. So we had 3 squared, and we need to add it onto the 0, and when we do, we should end up with 9. And when we go through and rewrite, it should be x plus 3 squared equals 9. Now that we know how to do this, we need to go through and practice this with an actual completing the square problem. So here's our actual notes for completing the square with conic style. Our standard we're focusing on today is MM3G2A, which is specifically talking about changing conic equations from general form to standard form. Now looking through, there are 4 steps. I'm going to have them over here on the left-hand side, and we have our equation over here on the right. So at this point, I'm going to start our recording. The first thing we have to do, just like we did, we're going to have to go through and do some grouping. Group our x terms together in the first set of parentheses and group our y's together in the second. And then once we have that done, we need to keep the signs with the terms and put a plus sign in between them, because we're still talking about a function here, and we can't forget our 0. Second thing we're going to do sometimes is factor out the numbers in front of the x squared and y squared. Now if you look here, there is no number that is shown, which means we don't have to do that step this time. Sometimes you'll have to do it, sometimes you won't, and that's okay. That means we're going to be moving on to step 3. We're going to go through and complete the square for each part. So as we go through, we need to find half of the b for the first set, which is going to be our 1, and find the square root of x squared, which when we do, we should end up with plain old x. And let's do the same thing for our second part. Half of the b for that set of parentheses is 2, and the square root of y squared here is going to be plain old y. So let's go through and fill it in just like we did on the other completing the square problem. So when we do, we have the x and the plus 1 squared in the first set, and we should have y plus 2 squared in the second set. And then don't forget your 0, it has to come down. And remember, from the other example we just did, we have to add the squares of what was in the parentheses to the right-hand side. So as we go through, we know 2 squared is 4 and 1 squared is 1, so 1 plus 0 plus 2 is 5. So let's go through and rewrite everything onto the same line. And this brings us down to our last step. The last step is we have to divide by the number on the right if we factored numbers out. Only if. If you didn't have to do step 2, then you skip step 4. That means that you will have a circle equation if you didn't have to do that step. For the next example, we will have to go through and do step 4. So here's our example problem. Take a second, copy it down. Okay, let's go through and let's work this. So, starting our recording. All right, let's do our grouping just like we did in the last one. All of our x terms go in the first set of parentheses, and our y terms go into the second. And because we've got to have all of our numbers on the other side, let's move that minus 8 to the other side by doing the opposite and add it. At this point, we're ready to factor out the numbers in front of the squared terms. If it has a negative with it, the negative has to go. So we need to divide the first one by 2 because it is a 2 in the front. Same thing with the y's. And anything that's left stays in the parentheses. So that's where the x squared plus 10x came from and the y squared minus 10y came from. At this point, we're ready to do our step 3, completing the square for each part. So just like we did on the last example, half of that term is 5. I don't know why that negative's there. And the square root of the first term there is x. Half of the term there is negative 5. Oh, sorry, shouldn't be square root of x, should be square root of y. Of y squared is y. And at this point, let's go through and get our parentheses ready. So our x comes down and our positive 5 comes down with the squared. And can't forget the 2 right there. It has to go down in the front. For the next set, let's do the same thing. The 2 comes to the front. Then we have our y, and our minus 5 squared equals 8. Now, if it factored a number out, it needs to multiply with the squared number when adding on the right. So we should have the 2 times the 5 squared. Do the squaring first and then multiply when you're going through and typing it in your calculator. Otherwise, you'll end up with wrong answers. And when you go through, 5 squared is 25 times 2 is 50. On the next one, you end up with a 50 as well. 50 plus 50 plus 8 is 108. And let's go through and rewrite. And since we had to do step 2, we have to do step 4, where we have to divide by the number on the right, since we did factor those numbers out. So everything is divided by 108. Because if you think, that's going to mean we're either having an ellipse or a hyperbola anytime you had to factor. So let's see. When you do 108 divided by 2, we have a 54. Same thing over here. And anything divided by itself is 1. So let's go through and write down what is left for our equation. And at this point, we are done. As you can tell, we have it equals 1, which we would think would be ellipse or hyperbola. We have a plus sign, which would tell us ellipse, but since both denominators are the same, it's actually a circle. It kind of tricked us. So that would be the end of this video.